On October 1, 1946, in Nuremberg, Germany, after more than 10 months of trial, 21 of Nazi Germany's leading political, military, and economic figures heard their verdicts. These top representatives of the criminal regime were finally forced to face justice before the International Military Tribunal for the atrocities committed during the Second World War. It was the first of many war crimes trials that would follow and stood as a warning to future dictators and perpetrators of mass violence. As the full scope of German crimes, particularly against the Jews, came to light, 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. Among them was German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. Wilhelm Keitel was born on September 22, 1882, in the village of Helmskerode, then part of the German Empire. At the age of 6, he lost his mother to childbed fever after the birth of his younger brother, Baudouin, who would later rise to the rank of infantry general. His father was a landowner, and Keitel initially intended to manage the family estates. However, when his father refused to retire, Wilhelm instead pursued a military career, joining the Prussian army as an artillery officer in 1901. In April 1909, Keitel married Lisa Fontaine, the daughter of a wealthy landowner who also owned the Wolfel Brewery, at the time one of the largest cooperatives in Europe. The couple had 6 children, though one died in infancy. The First World War broke out on July 28, 1914. Keitel served on the Western Front as a battery commander and later as a staff officer. That same year, he was severely wounded by shrapnel in Flanders, but recovered and, due to his organizational skills, was assigned to the Army General Staff in 1915. The war ended on November 11, 1918, with the signing of the Armistice in Compiègne. The conflict had claimed 10 million soldiers' lives and devastated entire nations with new weapons like machine guns and chemical warfare. In the aftermath, the victorious Allies imposed harsh treaties on the defeated powers. Chief among them, the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, placed full blame on Germany, demanded massive reparations, stripped the country of 13% of its territory, demilitarized the Rhineland, and restricted the German army to just 100,000 men. In the new Weimar Republic, 1918 to 1933, Keitel remained in the downsized Reichswehr and helped organize the paramilitary Freikorps, units of World War I veterans who were officially tasked with suppressing communist uprisings but often acted against the Republic itself, even committing political assassinations. By 1924, Keitel had been transferred to the Reichswehr Ministry in Berlin. As a colonel, he worked in the Truppenamt, an agency that secretly continued the functions of the banned German General Staff. The death of his father and the encouragement of his wife, who preferred the prestige of being an officer's wife over running a farm, solidified his decision to remain in the military. Keitel became deeply involved in Germany's covert rearmament, overseeing the secret expansion of the army in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Even after Adolf Hitler and the Nazis seized power in 1933, the buildup of military strength remained largely hidden, using cover organizations like glider clubs, sports associations, and Nazi militias for training. Over time, however, the rearmament became overt and massive. In Nazi Germany, all authority ultimately rested with Adolf Hitler. Keitel became one of his most loyal subordinates, unquestioningly carrying out the Führer's wishes. Among his peers, he earned the reputation of being Hitler's blindly obedient toady and was derided for his lack of independent judgment. In 1935, Keitel was appointed head of the Armed Forces Office at the Reich War Ministry. 3 years later, after the ministry was dissolved, it was replaced by the Armed Forces High Command, OKW, which gave Hitler full control as Supreme Commander. Keitel, now Chief of the High Command and holding the title of Reich Minister, became second in military hierarchy only to Hitler himself. This appointment surprised many, including Keitel, as he was widely regarded as unfit for the role. Fellow officers saw him as nothing more than a sycophant, often bypassing him to deal directly with Hitler. The Führer himself valued Keitel not for his skill, but for his unquestioned obedience, once describing him as loyal as a dog. Keitel fully supported Hitler's revisionist plans to overturn post-war borders. In early 1938, when Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg announced a referendum on whether Austria should unite with Germany or remain independent, Hitler threatened invasion. Keitel was ordered to conduct military maneuvers near the Austrian border to create the appearance of imminent attack, pressure that forced Austria into the Anschluss. On March 11, 1938, Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg resigned from office. The following day, German troops marched into Austria, and on March 13, the country was formally incorporated into the Reich. Crowds gathered to welcome Adolf Hitler. For his role in the annexation, known as the Anschluss, the Nazi regime's first act of territorial expansion, Wilhelm Keitel received the Anschluss Medal. The Second World War began on September 1, 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland. Keitel played a central role in planning the campaign and was fully aware of its criminal intent, as mass arrests, deportations, and killings had been organized long beforehand. Ethnic cleansing was to be carried out systematically against the Polish population. On September 7th, Reinhard Heydrich declared that Polish nobles, clergy, and Jews should be exterminated. 5 days later, Keitel expanded the list to include the Polish intelligentsia. In just the first months of occupation, between autumn 1939 and spring 1940, approximately 60,000 people, including officials, reserve officers, landowners, priests, scientists, teachers, lawyers, and doctors, were executed in what became known as the intelligentsia action. Among them were also over 1,000 prisoners of war. When some officers began to voice concerns about the atrocities in Poland and other occupied territories, Keitel ignored them, allowing brutality to continue until soldiers and commanders alike became desensitized to the horrors. For his loyalty following the Polish campaign, Keitel was rewarded with a bonus of 100,000 Reichsmarks. On May 10, 1940, Germany invaded France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands in what became known as the Battle of France. Within 6 weeks, these countries had fallen. After France's defeat, Keitel hailed Hitler as the greatest warlord of all time. To further humiliate the French, Hitler ordered the armistice to be signed in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed its surrender in 1918. The carriage was brought out of a museum and transported to the Campine forest, turning the site of Germany's earlier humiliation into the stage for Nazi triumph. On June 22, 1940, General Keitel signed the armistice for Germany, while General Hunziker signed for France. Shortly afterward, Keitel was promoted to Field Marshal. Yet this did little to improve his standing among Nazi leaders. Many still looked down on him, and Hermann Göring famously remarked that Keitel possessed a sergeant's mind in a field marshal's body. From April 1941 onward, Keitel issued and signed a series of criminal orders authorizing the execution of Jews, civilians, and non-combatants under virtually any pretext, while granting the perpetrators immunity from prosecution. In the same period, he was also deeply involved in preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. Before the campaign began, Hitler demanded detailed studies, including economic assessments. Wehrmacht economic chief George Thomas pointed out major problems: incompatible railway systems, shortages of vehicle tires, and, most crucially, fuel supplies that would last only 2 months. Keitel brushed these concerns aside, telling Thomas that Hitler did not want to hear it. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941. That September, Keitel ordered commanders on the Eastern Front to use unusual severity against resistance, decreeing that the killing of 1 German soldier should be answered with the execution of 50 to 100 communists. He also pressed for harsher reprisal policies in occupied territories. In October 1942, he signed the Commando Order, which mandated the execution of captured Allied special forces, even if they were in uniform or attempting to surrender. Keitel also drafted the infamous Night and Fog Decree, which allowed German authorities to abduct resistance members under cover of darkness so that they would disappear without a trace. Applied across occupied Western Europe, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, this policy resulted in about 7,000 arrests. Prisoners were often tortured, and survivors were deported to concentration camps such as Gross-Rosen and Natzweiler-Struthof. The decree was designed to terrorize local populations by denying families any knowledge of their loved one's fate. In addition, Keitel authorized reprisals against the families of Allied volunteers. Yet he too was not untouched by the war. His youngest son, Hans George, was killed in July 1941 during the invasion of the Soviet Union, an operation his father had helped orchestrate. By the end of the war, his eldest son, Karl Heinz, was captured and became a Soviet prisoner of war. On July 20, 1944, a group of conspirators led by Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb. After the explosion, Keitel personally helped escort the wounded Führer from the room. In the days following the failed assassination attempt, Hitler ordered a massive manhunt for conspirators, which dragged on for months. Thousands of suspects were dragged before the notorious People's Court for show trials, though this practice was eventually halted, as it gave defendants a stage to denounce the regime. In total, more than 7,000 people were arrested, with 4,980 executed, often on the flimsiest of evidence. Wilhelm Keitel himself sat on the Army Court of Honor, which expelled and handed over numerous officers to the Gestapo. On Hitler's personal orders, Keitel also dispatched 2 generals to the famed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, whose exact role in the conspiracy remains debated to this day. They offered Rommel a choice: suicide or court-martial. To protect his family, Rommel chose suicide, swallowing a cyanide pill. Officially, it was announced that he had died from wounds sustained when his staff car was strafed in Normandy, and he was given a state funeral. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. A week later, on May 7 in Reims, France, Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, signed Germany's unconditional surrender on behalf of Karl Donitz, Hitler's short-lived successor. Hours later, the Soviet High Command rejected the Reims Act, insisting that Wilhelm Keitel, as supreme commander of all German forces, must personally sign the instrument of surrender. Their reasoning stemmed partly from fears of a repeat of the stab in the back myth from World War I, which falsely claimed that Germany's army had not been defeated in battle but betrayed by traitors on the home front, particularly Jews and communists. As a result, a second ceremony was arranged in Berlin. Late on May 8, 1945, Wilhelm Keitel signed the definitive German instrument of surrender, formally ending World War II in Europe. Justice soon caught up with him. Arrested by the Allies, he was brought before the Nuremberg Trials, where leading figures of the Nazi regime faced judgment. Keitel was charged with conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He admitted that he had known many of Hitler's orders were illegal, but insisted he was only obeying commands, and that responsibility rested solely with Hitler. Regarding the atrocities, he argued that they had unfolded step by step, without foreseeing the full consequences, a tragic fate, as he put it. In private, he confessed he would endure more torment of conscience in his cell than anyone could ever imagine. Prison psychiatrist G.M. Gilbert, however, dismissed him bluntly, saying Keitel had no more backbone than a jellyfish. On October 1, 1946, the International Military Tribunal found him guilty on all charges and sentenced him to death by hanging. His plea for a soldier's death by firing squad was denied, as his crimes were deemed criminal, not military. On October 16, 1946, before his execution, Keitel told the prison chaplain, "You have helped me more than you know. May Christ, my Savior, stand by me all the way. I shall need him so much." He took communion before being led to the gallows. His executioner, American Sergeant John C. Woods, had little formal training, and it is believed he deliberately botched the hangings to inflict maximum suffering on the condemned. Instead of an instant death by broken neck, the drop was too short, and most of the 10 Nazi leaders executed that day died slowly by strangulation. For Keitel, it was even more brutal. After declaring his final words, "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. I now follow my sons, all for Germany." He was dropped through a trapdoor too small to allow a clean fall. His neck did not break, and he suffered severe head injuries as he convulsed violently for 28 agonizing minutes before dying. He was 64 years old. Afterward, his body was cremated, and the ashes scattered in the river Isar. No one mourned Wilhelm Keitel. Thanks for watching the History of Front channel.